And I'm just going to go through quickly the learning objectives that I've put for this session. So hopefully by the end of the session, you should all be able to differentiate or have some idea of the differences between visual capabilities and visual skills. You should be able to identify how certain issues of the visual system can go on to impact on sports performance, and also understand how improving certain aspects of the visual system can subsequently improve performance. Mark has done a very good job of introducing me, so I don't need to go through any of this apart from to highlight that I run my own business, Performance Vision Limited, and I'm also at a university in the UK called AECC University College. So if any of you want to get in contact in the future, there are plenty of ways to do so. So a brief kind of overview of how the visual system can impact on performance. When you watch sports, particularly things like football or team sports like that, you'll often hear commentators talk as if the players have some kind of magical ability, saying things like they always seem to be in the right place at the right time, or they're one step ahead of their opponent, as if this is something that certain players are just born with and everyone else can just dream of. Well, I'd really like to emphasize that that isn't the case. All these things about being able to read the game and therefore be one step ahead of other people is down to having good visual abilities and being able to pick up cues to identify what's going to happen in advance, and therefore be able to take advantage of those. And on the screen you can see some other areas which have been shown to be underpinned by good visual abilities. I'm just going to show a short video now to highlight an example of a football player in the match demonstrating good visual skills. So I want you to watch the player who takes a shot at goal.
Just couldn't get to that one. That in its way tells you just how much he's suffering. Naeem hitting a long one, and he's gone in! Amazing! David Seaman, all he could do is lie in the back of his goal, and with the most extraordinary goal possibly that's ever been scored in a European game, certainly in a European final, Zaragoza looked as though they've stolen it.
So for anyone old enough and interested in UK football who might remember, that was in a European Cup final a number of years ago now. But the person who struck the ball had to take in and process an awful lot of different visual information in a short space of time under immense pressure, in order to be able to coordinate and produce the goal scoring action. So he had to be able to track the ball that was breaking loose at his feet, so watch things close up, scan into the distance to identify the goalkeeper off his line, hopefully use his peripheral vision to see if there were any other options available before putting all of that together to execute the skill. However, there's the flip side of the coin as well. There are many athletes, particularly young athletes, who potentially get written off very early in their life just because of symptoms of poor vision. So things that could be put right if some improvements were made to their visual system, instead of what usually happens is trying to just hammer home the technical skills of a sport or the movement patterns, instead of looking and considering that vision might be an underlying issue. So this happens a lot at lower levels in sport, but it also happens in the higher levels of sport, where athletes might be very good a lot of the time, but at certain moments their visual system does break down to lead to, in the sporting context, disastrous outcomes. Again, I'm just going to show a short video. This is including the same goalkeeper. It's nothing personal about him. There's just good examples using him. So this time I do want you to look at the goalkeeper and identify what happens in this sequence.
Seaman's been beaten. It's a goal. It's Ronaldinho.
Okay, so I'm going to show that to you one more time, because what I want you to focus on is after the ball is already in flight, so nothing is going to change its direction because it's high in the air, the goalkeeper takes a few minor steps forward. So he must have read the visual information wrong, or had it so drilled into his mind that the ball was going to be a cross and he had to step forward that he just ignored the visual information altogether, because there is no reason once the ball is in flight for him to take those steps forward. So I'm just going to play it again, so just watch for those small shuffle forward. Oh.
Seaman's been beaten. It's a goal. It's Ronaldinho.
So if he hadn't taken that shuffle forward, he may not have still made the save. It was an extremely good shot, but he would have given himself a chance. So it shows that even at that highest level of performance, small breakdowns in vision can affect big things to do with sporting performance. So I'm going to break down a little bit more now about what I mean when I talk about vision, because it's not just what you see and how the eyes bring in the information. Now, over the years, there have been a variety of different methods to try and classify the visual system. On the left of the screen, you can see the more typical information processing type of model where you have your input through the eyes, processing in the brain, and then output through the motor system. On the right side of the screen, you can see where the visual system is divided into hardware and software. And this is probably the system that is used most within the visual field at the moment, where hardware are those more optometric properties and the software skills are those more dynamic sports specific skills. So software example would be maybe scanning and reading the play, whereas a hardware example might be to do with your actual visual acuity or your peripheral awareness. Now, my issue with these two systems is that currently, again, there's very much a focus around the software, the processing and the output side of things, and largely the input through the eyes or the hardware system is very much overlooked or ignored or written off. And one of the main reasons for this is what is an excellent paper, which was written in 2018, the Modified Perceptual Training Framework. And in this paper, the researcher and his colleagues attempted to try and show where, if you're looking to train vision, which is something that's becoming increasingly popular in elite sport, where should you focus that training to happen? And they came up with 3 areas that a visual skill should have in order for you to bother focusing on training it. So these 3 areas suggested that the targeted visual skill should discriminate between athletes of different skill levels, that improvements in that particular visual skill should be possible through training, and any improvement in the skill should transfer to enhanced on-field performance. Now, some of these statements I definitely agree with. So there's no point in training a skill if it's not possible to actually improve that skill through training it. So I 100% agree with that. However, the first area, that the targeted skill should discriminate between athletes of different skill levels, I think if you're looking at software skills, you do see that athletes and elite athletes are far better at these because of their task-specific knowledge than novices or lower level athletes. However, in those hardware optometric properties, you don't necessarily see, particularly if you're talking in terms of group differences, you don't necessarily see differences between elite athletes and novice athletes. And my theory on this is that, well, why should you? You wouldn't necessarily expect if you look at something not visual, for example, sprint speed, if you tested a lot of elite football players on their sprint speed versus a lot of club level athletes, then you wouldn't necessarily expect to see differences in sprint speed, primarily because many footballers may have reached the elite level by not really using sprint speed as one of the core components of their performance ability. They may have developed really good passing, control, defending, tackling, lots of different skills that are not necessarily focused around their sprint speed. And my thoughts about vision are exactly the same. An athlete might have really poor peripheral vision, but the way they play the game doesn't necessarily involve a large peripheral vision. But that's not to say that their performance could not be improved by improving sprint speed or equally improving peripheral vision. And I think this is important, particularly if instead of looking things at a group level, which unfortunately most research has to, but in fact looks at things on an individual basis. And when I work in the applied field, that's very much what I'm able to do. So you can pick up areas where athletes might have these deficiencies, which by improving them could improve their game. And then we have the third point about any improvement in the skill should transfer to enhanced on-field performance. And again, I absolutely think this is the case, but you cannot necessarily just expect that by improving an optometric property, an athlete knows how to take advantage of that in their sport. particularly if they're already at the elite level where they've developed their game in one way. You need to help to train that person in how to implement that skill to improve their game instead of assuming that it would make an automatic difference. So that's just a little bit about where my theoretical standpoint on this comes from. So I'm trying to develop a new framework on this, which is still very much a work in progress and isn't finalized yet. But the basic premise of it shows that those, what I call visual capabilities, so what your visual system is actually capable of, the optometric properties, sit at the base of the pyramid. So they are extremely important. They underpin everything else that is going to build on top of them. But yes, they might not differentiate between athletes of different abilities. They are not the direct link to improved performance, but they are vitally important. Sitting above these, I think, are those visual skills, so the more sport specific areas related to the visual system, where you can perhaps find quicker wins in many areas if you're looking to train visual skills, and obviously overall performance sits on top of these. So if we look first at the visual capabilities and what I mean in a little bit more detail by these. So there are lots of different visual capabilities, but a huge chunk of them are related to things like the muscles of the eye. So every person's eyes are controlled by skeletal muscles. So these skeletal muscles of the eye work in the same way as your biceps or hamstrings would. Now, with the eye muscles, we don't need them to be any stronger than they are already. They're not going to suddenly have to lift and move an eyeball that is much heavier. That just doesn't happen. But you can train these muscles to work faster, to work more accurately, and also to work in better coordination with each other. And these are really important skills for sport. If you're scanning a pitch, you need to be able to move your eyes very precisely between one point and another. You want to be able to scan as much as possible without your eyes becoming fatigued, or under different lighting conditions without becoming fatigued, and also to be able to work in really precise coordination with each other. And what I'm going to do now is highlight an example of when an athlete I worked with did struggle with that binocularity and the connection between the two eyes. So this is a rugby player that I worked with. He was playing for a Premiership team in England. He had all the physical attributes to be a very good player. He played on the wing, so he was very fast, very powerful. But he had a big problem in that when a high ball was kicked towards him, he had really poor catching skills under that high ball. So the ball would tend to hit his chest and bounce back out again, and he would catch the ball on the rebound off his chest or miss it on the rebound off his chest, which would then obviously lead to a delay in his next movement or no next movement because he's fumbled the ball altogether. And the coaches obviously knew that this was an issue. The opposition all knew this was an issue and would target him for this. And the coaches spent hours and hours trying to drill him just to practice those catching skills. But when I came in to work with him, what we were able to do is to look and see if there was an underlying visual capability issue that might be leading to this problem. So I looked at him in did a number of different tests. I also had an optometrist to have a look at him. And what we discovered was that one of his eyes had a very tiny prescription required for it. A small prescription, it was 0.05, I think, or 0.25, the smallest prescription that you could have that in the normal everyday world, you would not bother to correct one eye with that level of prescription. You'd be absolutely fine in the everyday world. But we identified that this might be manifesting itself as an imbalance between the two eyes, which then means that the brain is getting two different pictures, one from each eye, one where the ball is further forward and one where it's a bit further back, which then leads to this confusion and the catching issue. So to try and rectify this, what we did is we had one contact lens fitted for the athlete, and then spent several weeks working on combining how the two eyes were feeding that information to the brain, and so that the neural pathways in the brain were able to adapt to the new picture that they were getting more quickly. And then we started to look to combine this with more catching drills out on the field. So we didn't expect just putting a contact lens in to solve the problems. There was definitely a period of training and adjustment that we worked through. But the outcome was that what had been a huge negative in his performance suddenly turned into a big strength. And after that period of training, he was much, much better at this catching ability. And it actually led him to be able to go on to achieve higher things in his rugby performance career. And all because of a visual capability issue, which, as we've said, it wouldn't necessarily differentiate between a group of different players. It's not something that you could just kind of train and expect a difference. It took the building blocks to be able to work through to help this individual player to improve their performance. So just to highlight some of the other visual capabilities and the links that I think that they have to performance. So saccadic speed, that's the speed that you can move your eyes from one point to another to then take in information. And this is something that people can do at varying speeds. Most people scan maybe around 3 times in a second. They're able to make these saccadic eye movements, but through training, this can be improved. And this could be linked to the scanning ability of a player. So if you're asking someone to scan to lots of different places, but they don't have that baseline saccadic speed, then their scanning ability would be limited. Peripheral vision is another area where you have a certain peripheral degree angle, but through training you can improve this. And if you think about that out on the field, if you are receiving the ball in, let's think about soccer because most people know that very easily. If you think about receiving a ball in soccer, but your peripheral vision is quite narrow, you might not notice your opponent closing you down from the right-hand side and your teammate who's out free on the left. So your first touch may take the ball towards your opponent, which manifests as poor decision making. But you can't necessarily make a better decision if your peripheral vision is quite narrow. So it's about improving the peripheral vision and then teaching the player how to utilize this so that their first touch and therefore their decision takes them towards their own players and away from the opponents. And there's the example I've just given of this binocularity, that coordination between the two eyes, and how that can link to skills such as catching a ball. So in the hierarchy of sports vision, I'm going to move on now from visual capabilities to visual skills. So there's a whole range of different visual skills. I'm going to just highlight a few of them as I go through, but these are very much what clubs tend to look for when they're looking for training. If you do train these, you can get some quicker wins in the applied world, and they tend to be more applicable to whole teams as opposed to having to take an individual view of them. So once we start to talk about visual skills, there's a much higher influence of the brain involved in those. And so this is why you start to see bigger differences between elite athletes and novices, because those elite athletes have had the years and years of sports specific knowledge to help the top down aspects of this process. So the brain controlling where you're going to decide to point your eyes. And this could be based on a range of different things. So you're in a match, where do you decide to look? Is it based on your previous experience? Is it based on the environment you're in, your expectations, the training that you've done, the future goals? If your tactic as a team is to always try and switch the ball to the right-hand side of the field, then you're going to start to scan to the right-hand side of the field earlier. And one way we can look and measure where the eyes are looking is using technology called eye tracking. So over the past probably decade or so, eye trackers, which are usually like a pair of glasses that you can wear that show exactly where the eyes are looking. The technology of that has advanced a lot. They're not at a stage where you can wear them in active competition, but I have definitely used eye trackers in training scenarios with athletes to try and identify where those athletes are looking. I'm just going to show a short video clip now of when we use the eye tracker on Ronaldo. Again, not a match situation, but trying to just see where he is looking in a one-on-one situation. And the person that he's up against was a presenter of the show, but he is also a former professional footballer, so he's not a complete novice in this situation.
But now, scientists are going to test his mental ability.
Sorry, I don't know what's happened there. Okay, so you could see from there the benefits of having the technology like an eye tracker to help, particularly to help identify various visual skills. So where people are looking, you can use it in the wider context to see kind of scanning behaviors across the whole pitch. or more individual things. So it's been used a lot in things like penalty taking, so where a goalkeeper looks when they're trying to save a penalty, where they're able to pick cues up from. So eye tracking can give us a really good insight into the information that the eyes are sending to the brain. But some limitations are that it only obviously picks up on what you're collecting through your central vision and has no impact on being able to identify what your peripheral vision is taking advantage of. Also, we need to identify that just because the eyes look at something doesn't necessarily mean that the brain sees it. And attention is another area that's very much falls under the bracket of visual skills. And again, I'm just going to show you a short video here.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Go!
So again, this is something that's really important for people to be aware of in sporting situations. So I've had people watch that video with an eye tracker on, and their eyes actually do pass over the moonwalking bear, but they don't recognize that they have seen it because it's not something that they're particularly trying to look for in that scenario. You're so caught up in trying to count the number of passes that that is all your brain is focused on. And this is something, again, that I work with athletes on with them and with coaches. What are you trying to get your players to attend to when they're out on the pitch? Do you want them to just be following the ball, or are there specific tactics that you might want to try and put into place? And if so, you need to teach them to scan for these things, because just telling players to scan is not an effective coaching method. So you might want to think, we always want to attack down the right hand channel, so your first scan should be over that way to see if we could get the ball there. It might be that the opposition have a particularly talented player, so you're working hard on drawing them out of position, so then you can attack where they were, in which case you'd always want to scan for where that particularly dangerous player is. So as a coach, you need to be able to use your tactics to get your players to pay attention to the right things rather than just this generic scanning information. And this again leads me to an example of when we had a breakdown on the visual skills side of things, which led to problems in actual performance. So in this case, I was working with a football team, and they had a player who just didn't seem to have that game awareness that the coach wanted them to have. The coach believed that they were focusing on the ball the whole time. The coach would tell the player to scan, and it just wasn't happening. So they were sent to me to see if there was a visual problem related to this. So I did various tests of the visual capabilities to start with. We identified that the peripheral vision was absolutely fine, no issues with that at all. The saccadic speed was slightly lower than I would have wanted to see, but nothing that you could consider a particular deficit, but something to work on. But through speaking to the player and using the eye tracker, we could see that the player just wasn't scanning to the appropriate areas to pick up information, but the player was putting their head up and turning it, because that is what, from a young age, players are being told to do now. So what you'll find now that more research has come out saying that the best footballers are those that scan more. So football coaches from a young age are telling their players to scan more. So young players are waving their head around, but because the coach is looking for them to scan, but they don't know where they're looking or what they're looking for. So actually all they're doing is taking their eyes off the ball for no benefit. And this is what we discovered with this player with the eye tracker. We could see that although the head and eyes were moving, there was no fixations in any areas for long enough to actually take information in. So we were able to look back and then work with the coach to say, okay, you say you want this player to scan more, but what information are you actually wanting them to pick up? Where should they be scanning? What for? And we broke down what the coach was hoping for and then developed the training of those skills to coincide with it to make sure that the scans were then happening to the right places at the right times to make that player far more effective through the use of these visual skills. Sorry, just need a quick drink. Okay, so next up we move on to the performance, the top part. This is the bit that all coaches are really just interested in. They, to be honest, rarely care what is going on behind the scenes or what you're doing. They just want their players to be performing better on the pitch, on the field, on the court, whatever it might be. So most vision training would focus solely on this area, and it is really important that as I work through vision training with a team, with individual athletes, that I might start with the visual capabilities, but I have to have the end point in mind of how it's actually going to improve performance. And so as the training develops and moves away from those baseline areas, we make that training as sport specific as possible so that it does then enhance that those neurological pathways in the athletes and makes it much more likely to actually transfer to changes in on-field performance. But if you try and do this without considering the other areas, it means that athletes might hit stumbling blocks because those underlying issues haven't previously been considered. I'm going to show one last video here, and this is an example of not work I was doing. This was another expert in sports vision working with the England rugby team back 20 years ago now, when we actually were quite successful at the Rugby World Cup.
Sudden death after a 5-minute break, and that looks to be the way we're heading unless England gets a late opportunity here.
Wilkinson will set it up here and he'll wait for his opportunity.
Cat absolutely monster.
He's back now behind the pocket. Wilkinson is waiting.
And Dawson goes himself. He fooled everyone. Wilkinson still in position here. Martin Johnson and England staying composed here. Wilson still in place for the drop goal. Australia come back. Here it is for Johnny. Has he done it? He sure has. Heartbreaker for the Wallabies. Seconds remaining. And that surely is the stairway to rugby heaven for England.
Sensational.
Time almost up. Seconds remaining. The player of the tournament, Johnny Wilkinson, has snatched it away from the Wallabies. Is this it? And England has joined Sir Alf Ramsey's Immortals of 1966.
Okay, so as you watched that video, you'd have seen various words pop up on the screen, and these are all some of those underlying visual capabilities, apart from the decision making, which would fit into the visual skill bracket. And these are all things that these players had worked on for months and months and months beforehand to then make sure that when they were in that sport specific situation, but also under the immense pressure of approaching overtime in a World Cup final, when lots of things related to the visual system particularly tend to go wrong, that they were able to still apply those skills to the performance level to achieve the outcome that they were after. So there are other benefits related to training of the visual system, both the visual capabilities and those visual skills. So there's some research out relatively recently suggesting that training the visual system can reduce the incidence of concussion in athletes. This is an area I'm really interested in looking at further. There's been a few studies looking at this, and it's shown that the vision training is most effective at reducing the linear and rotational head accelerations, and also that it's best at reducing the risk of the mild to medium head injuries rather than those really traumatic ones. Most of the research of this has been done in American football, where obviously helmets are worn, so it'd be very interesting to look at studies of this in non-helmet wearing sports as well. A really interesting study by Clark et al. Demonstrated that following a vision training program that was implemented for American footballers during pre-season, and then they continued to just do top-up sessions weekly through the season, and they found an 85% reduction in incidence of concussion compared to the previous 2 or 3 seasons that they'd been collecting the data for. Now, we're not really sure why vision training can reduce the incidence of concussion, the most likely theories are that this increase in awareness or your periphery, that split second extra time that players have because they're taking in information more quickly, gives them the chance to just move their body and head out of the way of those really major impacts. So then turning a major into potentially a more minor impact. And I've also worked with a number of athletes who have suffered from concussion and are trying to rehab from that. So those athletes where the concussion hasn't recovered itself within the normal protocol, the normal sort of week to 10 days, if it's ongoing, then I've worked a lot with those athletes doing some very, very basic, low level, easy vision training, because there do seem to be these big links between concussion and returning to play, and that vision system helping with that. So that's definitely another area where vision is beginning to have more of an impact. There's also a number of studies looking at using various vision methods to diagnose concussion as a quicker and easier way, but I think that other methods will overtake vision in using that. But it's definitely another area for consideration of where vision training and awareness of vision can be important. So what does all of this mean in terms of the wider sports workforce? I'm very aware that I'm talking to a group of professionals here who are not going to be specifically working as vision trainers with people. So what is the purpose of this information for you, and what can you do with it? So firstly, it's just awareness. Sports vision is a relatively new field of science, and it's something that I think can be implemented in a number of different ways, not just helping athletes reach their on-pitch peak of performance, but I think there's a number of other areas which it has a significant impact. Concussion is one of them, but also I've been looking at various research about athletes re-injuring themselves when they're going back out onto the field, and I think that this potentially could be something that vision training could help reduce. It's an area I'm really interested in studying. Lots of rehab work, the athlete can be focused purely on stabilizing movements using their visual system to help protect where their injury has been. And then when you throw them back out into the sports environment and their visual system has to be involved in just playing the game, I believe that they're more likely to re-injure themselves. Whereas if vision training is integrated into that rehab work so that they're not able to use the visual system to just help prevent re-injury, then that could help overcome some of that, is something that I'm interested in working on. And so just this awareness that vision isn't just something that athletes have and, let's throw them out onto the pitch. There are lots of ways that it can be implemented to help improve various aspects of sports and performance and rehabilitation. Also want to just be aware that the visual system is like any other muscle group. The muscles make up one big part of the visual system. They're absolutely not everything, but to recognize that it is something that is trainable and can be improved through work. And I've obviously just said about considering the visual impact on injury occurrence, rehabilitation, and that wider area, not just performance. So I'm just going to go back to the learning objectives from the beginning, and hopefully you will all recognize that you should be able to do these things now. So differentiating between those visual capabilities, the underlying more optometric properties, and the visual skills, which are those ones that have more of the neurological involvement, the more sport specific understanding involved in them. Identify how certain issues of the visual system can impact on sports performance. So I've spoken through a couple of different case studies related to that, and how improving certain aspects of the visual system can subsequently lead to improvements in performance. I have a variety of references that my talk here has referred to at various points, and so I will leave those up there. I'll be able to send those round, and thank you very much for listening.